The U.S. Marines hid a war stockpile in Norway, and Russia is watching. There is a U.S. Marine Corps war stockpile hidden inside a Norwegian mountain. That sounds like the opening line of a Tom Clancy novel, and honestly, Clancy would have written it exactly that way, but it's real. It's been real for nearly 4 decades, and in 2026, it matters more than it has since the Cold War ended. The Marine Corps Pre-Positioning Program Norway stores vehicles, cold weather gear, and mission-essential equipment in climate-controlled caves across the country. The logic is simple. If Marines have to deploy to the high north, they don't spend weeks shipping everything across the Atlantic after the shooting starts. They fly in, link up with equipment that's already there, and move. That's not glamorous, that's just logistics. FedEx would be proud. And logistics is what separates a military operation from a bunch of heavily armed people having a very expensive camping accident. Now, Norway's own security service is warning that Russia may intensify espionage and sabotage activity there in 2026. The targets that PST listed aren't abstract. They include military sites, allied exercises, Norway's support for Ukraine, and logistics infrastructure tied to Ukrainian aid, which means the caves just became a Russian intelligence priority. Hey friends, I'm Wes O'Donnell, defense journalist, Army and Air Force veteran, and I love my crayon-eating devil dogs out there. Semper Fi, you crazy bastards. Today we're talking about Norway, not as a scenic NATO ally with fjords and excellent winter troops, but as one of the most strategically sensitive countries in the alliance, and one that Russia is actively working to understand, map, and where possible, undermine. Russia doesn't share a long land border with Norway the way it does with Finland or the Baltic states. Norway isn't the obvious first target scenario in most European threat assessments. So why is Russian intelligence pointing at Norway in 2026 like it just found something on a map it hadn't fully appreciated before? Well, the answer is what's directly next door. Norway's northern territory sits adjacent to the Kola Peninsula, which hosts Russia's northern fleet and a substantial portion of its sea-based nuclear deterrent. The Northern Fleet's access to the North Atlantic runs directly through waters Norway watches. If Russia ever wanted to threaten NATO's northern flank, complicate reinforcement routes, or project naval power into the Atlantic during a crisis, Norway becomes unavoidable. Layer on top of that Norway's role as Europe's top pipeline gas supplier, its active support for Ukraine, and its consistent hosting of allied exercises near some of Russia's most sensitive military infrastructure. Take all of that and you've got a country that isn't sitting on NATO's periphery, it's sitting on Russia's doorstep. Norway doesn't have to do anything provocative to be interesting to Moscow. It just has to be Norway in 2026. So the Marine Corps says the pre-positioning program cuts more than a month from deployment timelines and saves millions in transportation costs. During Exercise Cold Response 26, Marines from Combat Logistics Regiment 27 and Combat Logistics Battalion 6 drew vehicles, cold weather gear, and mission-essential equipment directly from these stocks. Blount Island Command issued more than 14,000 items from the Norway program during that exercise alone. That is a full rehearsal. Cold is a weapon. Mountains are a weapon. Distance is a weapon, especially against a force whose supply chain starts across the Atlantic. Arctic operations make everything slower, heavier, and more demanding. And you can't deploy Marines into Norway with standard equipment and a motivational speech from Les Brown. If Marines arrive with people but no gear, they haven't deployed a force, they've deployed a problem with dog tags. The Marine Corps Norway program, called MCPP-N, solves that problem before the crisis begins, which is the only useful time to solve it, by the way. As an Army and Air Force veteran, I've got a Marine joke. Stop me if you've heard this one. But there's an Air Force fighter pilot sitting at a bar. He turns to the guy next to him and he says, "Hey buddy, want to hear a Marine joke?" And the guy says, "Sure, but before you tell that joke, you should know I'm a Marine." And the guy sitting next to me, he's a Marine. And the guy sitting next to him, he's a Marine. So, you still want to tell that joke? And the Air Force fighter pilot says, "Nope, don't want to have to explain it 3 times.
Hilarious!
Oh boy, shots fired. I can't wait to read the comment section on this one. Okay, so what is Cold Response 26? Cold Response 26 isn't just a winter exercise. where Marines discover that Norway is cold in a very personal and spiritually damaging way. It's validation of the whole concept. Can U.S. forces arrive, draw equipment, integrate with Allied logistics, and move into a high North fight on a timeline that actually matters? That exercise answers the question in front of everyone, including Russian intelligence. It tells Norway the American commitment is physical, not just a sentence in a treaty. It tells Russia that if something happens in the Arctic, U.S. Marines don't have to begin by asking where they left the trucks. And it tells Russian planners that the timeline they'd be working against is significantly shorter than a standard transatlantic deployment would suggest. It is deterrence in its least glamorous and most useful form. Now, I know Trump is pulling U.S. troops out of Europe. Let's just assume for a moment that Trump is not always going to be in power. That's why we're still talking about European security with U.S. support. Listen, folks, it is kind of stupid to remove U.S. troops from Europe because you got your feelings hurt. That's all I'm saying. What I can tell you is that the northern flank has always been serious to the people whose job it is to watch it. What's changed in 2026 is that it's serious to more people, including Norway's own security service, in ways that we're now willing to say publicly. Norway's Police Security Service published its 2026 threat assessment, and it reads like a document written by people who spent time watching what Russia actually does rather than what it claims to intend. PST says Norway faces its most serious security situation since World War II. It expects Russian intelligence to focus on military targets, allied exercises, Norway's support for Ukraine, and Arctic operations in general, including the Marines' little stash away in Norwegian caves. It warns that Russia may pursue sabotage of logistics tied to Ukrainian support with the aim of creating unrest, reducing capability, and weakening Norway's political will to keep supporting Kyiv. That's hybrid warfare described without euphemism. Don't hit the tank, hit the port, the warehouse, the cable, and the political will until a democracy decides the cost of support is too high. Now, the most disturbing element in PST's assessment involves Ukrainian refugees. Norway hosts around 100,000 Ukrainians who fled Russia's war. PST warns that Russian intelligence is attempting to recruit some of them for intelligence gathering or unlawful activity, specifically targeting those with family members on property in Russian-occupied Ukrainian territory. That's coercion of the most cynical kind. Threaten someone's family across a border Russia controls, and suddenly a person who fled your war becomes a reluctant asset inside NATO's logistics infrastructure. Norway. PST also flags that Russian vessels operating commercially along Norway's coastline can conduct intelligence activity on port, infrastructure, and allied movements. Russia loves the gray zone between peace and war, using commercial cover and plausible deniability to collect quietly over time. Plausible deniability is basically the Kremlin's national cologne. To be clear, none of this means Russia is about to invade Norway. That's not the argument, and anyone making that argument is outrunning the evidence. Russia doesn't need to invade Norway to damage Norway's strategic value to NATO. Surveillance, sabotage, source recruitment, influence operations, maritime intelligence collection can all degrade Norway's effectiveness as an ally without triggering Article 5. That's the competition Norway is already in. It's not a future scenario either. The Marine Corps K program looks like a logistics story. Put it in the context of Norway's threat picture, and it becomes a deterrence calculation. Russia can surveil the ports, monitor the exercises, and map the infrastructure. What it can't change is the math those caves create. U.S. Marines can show up in the high north faster than any reinforcement timeline requiring a transatlantic shipment. Russia has to account for that. And every variable Russia has to account for is one more friction in a planning process that depends on speed, surprise, and confident assumptions about NATO's response time. That's deterrence doing its job quietly in a mountain in a country most people underestimate. Norway's coastline is enormous and genuinely difficult to fully protect against gray zone threats. Hybrid operations, infrastructure sabotage, and source recruitment are harder to defend against than conventional military incursion. And PST's warning is a warning, not a guarantee that Norway's current defenses are adequate to meet what's coming. The pre-positioning program works when it's exercised, maintained, and tightly integrated with Norwegian forces. Cold Response 26 validates that. Whether it scales fast enough under real crisis conditions is a question only a real crisis will fully answer, but Russia's strategy against NATO's edges depends on NATO being slow, divided, and uncertain about where the threat is actually coming from. Norway makes that strategy harder for Moscow. Its military understands Arctic warfare at a level most NATO members don't. Its security service names Russian threats publicly instead of hoping they go away quietly. And it hosts American Marines whose equipment is already waiting in the mountains before any crisis begins. The Kremlin understands logistics, it's just bad at them. It's constantly catastrophic at executing them, as anyone who's watched Russia's convoy disasters outside Kyiv can confirm, but it understands that NATO's ability to move fast is part of NATO's power. So those caves keep getting maintained. Cold response keeps getting planned. The timeline keeps getting shorter. Russia can watch all at once. The gear is still there in Norway. That is it for today, my friends. If this was useful, please hit that subscribe button. It is the best free way to support the work I do here, and it prevents me from selling my stripping services at bachelorette parties. I cover NATO, Ukraine, modern military technology 4 times a week. For deeper analysis, I'm over on Substack, where subscribers get the longer pieces and early access to topics before they become videos. And as always, glory to Ukraine, glory to the heroes. Crimea is Ukraine.